4 unknown Russian sources reported on May 24, 2024, that Putin is proposing a truce. This agreement may define new borders depending on frontline locations. Russia would keep its seized regions, while Ukraine would keep its defended ones. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has refused to negotiate peace despite Putin's goodwill. Why would Putin desire a ceasefire after a protracted war? Is this a retreat or a strategy to conceal something? Why did Putin suddenly change the conflict? Job and dispute. Before beginning the video, the channel would like to thank Reza Karami for his support. Let's continue today's topic. Putin has recommended this. When questioned about Reuters stories in Belarus, Putin urged to resume peace talks with a condition. He also said that negotiations must be based on reality, not what one side desires. The first reason Putin is willing to negotiate may be those ground realities. He feels he's secured enough territory. The BBC can show how important those benefits were. It published maps in May 2024 showing how much Ukrainian land Russia controls. Some observers say Russian forces have crossed the international boundary between Belgorod and Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, to make tactically significant advances. Russia took several northern territories around Vovchansk, including the town's hospital, and territory in Staritsya, according to the ISW. If Russia secures Vovchansk in a ceasefire agreement, the border between Russia and Ukraine would drop to 72 kilometers from Kharkiv, not far enough to take Ukraine's second city, but close enough to make it an obvious target if Russia relaunches the war. Even here, ceasefire discussions would certainly cause conflicts. Russia claims these wins, but Ukraine says it's stabilizing Kharkiv. Putin may argue that Russia's 3,000 troops in the region are doing fewer operations because they're preparing a major operation to assault the city. A disagreement might stall talks. Russia controls more of Ukraine's east. Putin controls much of the territory, including tactically important sites. He controls Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, and Avdiivka, a defended town. This land is crucial because it might give Russia a passage deeper into Ukraine and a defensive posture to prevent Ukrainian soldiers from entering Donetsk. Melitopol is southwest of Donbass in Russia. Next, Bakhmut. Moscow conquered Bakhmut on May 22, 2024, according to Russian media. Comparing this success to Russia's seizure of Berlin during World War II showed its importance in Moscow. One Russian anchor said, "The myth that Artyomovsk is an unassailable fortress has been crushed." Russian media quickly restored the city's original Soviet moniker. For the record, Ukraine maintains city combat continues. Russian victory over Bakhmut is as significant as that over Avdiivka. The city is another Russian stronghold and possible entrance into Ukraine. What Putin wants to say in ceasefire talks becomes evident. Russia is slowly annexing Ukraine. If you give that area to Russia now, Ukraine can stop further advances. Moscow might benefit from gaining land in Ukraine's north, but it's not a priority compared to the east. Ukraine would suffer greatly. Russia controls more Ukrainian territory than Ukraine liberated in its 2023 counteroffensive, according to the Washington Post. Ukraine will negotiate from a worse position than last year. Ukraine is failing to retain numerous Eastern Front sites, making matters worse. In a May 2024 Reuters piece, Ukrainian gun commander Oleksandr Kosachenko discussed his unit's ammunition issues. Kosachenko's M777 howitzer fired 100 shells a day into Russian positions earlier in the war. Putin's negotiation method. We now consider firing 30 shells a luxury. This gives Putin good reason to discuss a truce. Russia has conquered a lot of Ukrainian lands, so Putin can bargain from a position of power, knowing that Ukraine will need time to build up its military with the billions in funding offered by numerous Western nations early in 2024. Putin has a problem too. He controls much of Ukraine, but not all regions. Even in Donbass, where Russia has made the most progress, a boundary following the war lines would divide it. Putin may not like that. He may instead claim that Russia should control all of Donbass, which Zelensky would likely reject. Still, Putin's desire for a truce may be justified by claiming Russia's land. One of the largest is that Putin thinks stopping the conflict and claiming the land Russia controls is enough to declare victory. Two Reuters sources say so. They both claim Putin believes Russia's war successes are enough to sell a win to the Russian people if the war ends today. Sell is the word. Putin started the war because he thought Ukraine didn't exist. He believes Ukraine is Russia and not an independent country anymore. Putin made this argument in his pre-war article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In July 2021, the Kremlin's website published an essay claiming Russians and Ukrainians are one people. He also claims this is a constant belief and a repeated claim. The rest of the essay reinforces Putin's position with a lengthy history lesson. He claims that Ukraine was drawn into a deadly geopolitical game to divide Europe and Russia and become a springboard against Russia. Putin presents his opinion of Ukraine and how he wants his people to view it. Ukraine was co-opted by sinister Western powers to weaken Russia. Hence, it's never been an independent state. Putin could convince his people that the conflict gained territory by ending it now. He may say he undermined the Russia-Europe border, hurting the West, especially NATO. Russian army morale and desertion. He could even convince his supporters that Russia could dismantle the barrier and take full control of Ukraine. Quitting now is not conceding. Putin can claim that Russia acquired land, which is a triumph in his perspective that it was Russia's. Putin's pitch would disclose another reason he wants a truce, but whether the Russian people would buy it is another matter. Russia is losing interest in war. A big part of Russian society has never wanted to go to war with Ukraine. A June 2023 BBC report shows that several 100,000 to several million Russians have departed the country since the war began. Many have fled to Georgia and Kazakhstan, while others have sought shelter in France and Germany. The BBC reports that people leaving either disagree with the war against Ukraine or want to avoid being enlisted into Russia's army. Putin also faces deserters. The Kyiv Independent reported in April 2024 that about 18,000 Russian Southern Military District servicemen had left their postings. The news agency also noted that 12,000 of those 18,000 are part of the 8th Combined Arms Army, which typically fights in eastern Ukraine. Deserters included 10,000 mobilized conscripts and 2,000 contracted soldiers. That's bad for Putin's morale. However, since these data come from Ukraine's military intelligence service, the Kyiv Independent reports could be Ukrainian propaganda. This could be true if not for other sources reporting similar concerns. According to Novaya Gazeta, Get Lost, which assists Russian deserters leave their troops, saw a tenfold spike in requests in January 2024. Get Lost claims 28 Russian soldiers fled in January 2023. The following year, 284 soldiers deserted, 50% contracted, and 30% recently mobilized reservists. Putin has tried to stop desertions. To prevent wartime escapees, Russia sentenced deserters to 10 years in jail. Poor conditions have led some Russian troops to intentionally hurt themselves to avoid service. Former Russian officer Ivan, who lives in Kazakhstan, says so. He alleges that he gave his soldiers longer leave numerous times, knowing that many would never return, and that Moscow's harsher punishments have only made Russian soldiers even more desperate. Running away from the front is perilous, he argues. People know there are criminal penalties, but yet do it. Some impersonate the dead or wounded. A few shoot themselves in the foot to flee a hospital. No wonder so many Russian soldiers desert. Ukraine has a shocking death rate. Damage to Russian military and economy. According to the UK Defence Journal, British intelligence officials believe over 45,000 Russian soldiers have died or been wounded since the war began. Russia entered Ukraine with 12,000, 16,000 troops. Hence, it has suffered 50% more casualties than first sent. Those guys are also observing massive Russian equipment destruction. Around 7,700 tanks and 10,000 armored vehicles have burned. Ukrainian attacks have reduced the Black Sea Fleet to 2/3 of its initial size, and 800 Russian artillery units are destroyed annually. Everything adds up to a war that shows Russia's people they can't easily defeat a smaller nation. It's a huge morale issue. That dilemma isn't helped by Russia's war spending. Reuters estimates that Russia spent at least $211 billion equipping and deploying its military between February 2022 and February 2024. Arms sales cancellations costed $10 billion. All of this is happening amid rising national poverty. That may surprise people who've read Russia's poverty rate is declining. Statista said that Russian poverty dropped to 9.9 million in the fourth quarter of 2023, the lowest in 3 years. How could Russia's poverty problem worsen since the Ukraine war? Russia changed how it measures poverty. Russian poverty was previously defined by food prices, according to a July 2023 insider report. Not anymore. Instead, it calculates poverty using regional coefficients to compare levels across regions. Russia considers Tula and Tambov to have lower living costs than the national average, with a regional coefficient of 0.83. So locals can afford lower wages, this tweak's result. The insider reports that 2.3 million people who would have slipped below Russia's poverty level under its prior method are no longer poor. This could cause folks in poverty to see billions spent on the military while being informed their living conditions aren't as bad as they think. Everything will be noted by Putin. He understands that prolonging the Ukraine war risks popularity. Even though he won a landslide presidential election, he realizes he must conform to his people's desire. He may show his people he wants peace by proclaiming a ceasefire on Russia's terms. If he wins, he stops the conflict and prevents millions of Russians from losing faith in him and his government. Another reason Putin may want a ceasefire. Taking more land in Ukraine may push Putin to mobilize the troops. Mobilization would worsen Russian morale. Tens of thousands of Russians fled after the September 2022 partial mobilization, which allowed Russia to call up 300,000 soldiers, according to Radio Free Europe. Unfortunately for Putin, that initial mobilization may not be enough to defeat Ukraine. As mentioned, it's gaining territory, but it now faces a Ukraine that may be energized by additional financial and military aid. Taking more land requires more troops to replace lost ones. Because of that, the Kremlin is planning a major military mobilization. Russia would recruit 300,000 more people to fight in the conflict, assuring it has the personnel to advance. That proposal has a flaw. Russians are increasingly opposed to a second military mobilization. Putin will know this reluctance to mobilize. His September 2022 mobilization decreased his popularity in Russia, with a Levada Center survey suggesting that only 53% of Russians felt Putin's special military operation would succeed. That was far lower than May 2022's 73%. The Kremlin's mobilization made 47% of Russians uneasy, afraid, or appalled, and 13% angry, according to the Levada Center. Only 23% were proud of Russia. Lack of appetite may lead to a second mobilization. The Atlantic Council found that 50–60% of Russians oppose a second mobilization wave in a variety of polls. Maybe that's why Putin has been slow to act. More mobilization would hurt his domestic support. It also suggests many Russians don't support him. Putin undoubtedly thought that his arguments that Ukraine is Russian property and that Russia should fight to reclaim it hadn't garnered enough volunteers for his special military mission. Putin's terms are hard for Ukraine to accept. You think? Will Putin give up any territory to end the war? Comment your ideas below. Thanks for viewing, and check out our channel for more.